Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's MUPU Dig call. I'm Emily Zoss from the National Gallery of Art, and we're very glad that you're here to join today's presentation on accessibility. It's nice to see where everyone's joining us from, so we hope that you'll take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat. And a few other reminders before we get started. Please check to make sure your mic is muted when you are not actually intending to speak. We're recording this session and it will be posted on our YouTube channel along with recordings of past calls. And if you are not already signed up to get notifications about our future calls, please make sure to join our mailing list. You'll see some instructions about that in the chat, and we have exciting presentations coming up. So please be sure to be on the lookout for those. We are very happy to welcome today's speaker, Leah Brochu from the National Network for Equitable Library Services. NELS provides digital public library services to Canadians with print disabilities, in addition to a range of digital publishing services for Canadian publishers, post-secondary institutions, and government clients. Their website includes invaluable resources created both by NELS and their partners on making accessible books. Some of the resources include recommendations for ebooks and audiobooks. There's a video series offering a crash course in ebook accessibility, knowledge base, tips on improving accessibility for Word docs. I can't recommend highly enough taking some time to explore the resources that they offer. They're leaders in the field, and we are hugely grateful to have Leah here to speak with us today about standards, techniques, and best practices for publishing accessible digital content. We'll plan on leaving a lot of time for Q&A at the end of Leah's presentation, so please be sure to add questions to the chat as you think about them, and we'll come back to those following her talk. So with that, Leah, thank you so much, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Emily. And yeah, thanks everyone. I'm excited to be here and I hope this is a useful session for you. So I'm just going to get my screen sharing. Share. So should be able to see that now. So yeah, thanks for introducing me, Emily. I'm Leah Brochu and I'm going to be talking about inclusion and accessibility in digital publications today. Before we get going, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that this session has participants from across North America and I think the wider world, but in North America particularly, there are people who live and work on unceded land and treaty land. I encourage you today to learn something new about the Indigenous history of the land you reside on. I'm attending the summit today from, old notes. I'm attending this session today from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, which is on Indigenous land in the Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. For the Nahiawak, the Anishinaabe, the Métis, the Niitsitapi, the Dene, and the Nakota Sioux, they have called this place home for thousands of years, and it's always been a traditional place for meeting and gathering. Because we're meeting in a virtual space, this acknowledgement is obviously very personal to my own physical location. So I encourage you, as you've been introducing yourselves, feel free to go to a great website called native-land.ca. You can use it to look up the people, the languages, the territories, and the treaties that are unique to your location. So it's very interesting. It's a great resource, native-land.ca. And now to talk about myself and NELS a little bit. So Emily gave a great little intro to NELS, but I'll just go a little bit further. NELS is a nonprofit organization in Canada. Our core work involves building and maintaining a repository of digital books in accessible formats for people with print disabilities in Canada. And this is distributed through a Canadian Public Library network. Through this original work, when we were founded in 2013, we became aware of the need for helping publishers learn how to make more accessible content. So we dove into the world of accessible publishing. The other big thing we're working towards is advancing the agenda of accessible publishing through our Accessible Publishing Summit, through ebook evaluations, sharing resources as on our website, our separate website, accessiblepublishing.ca, and more. And we also prioritize offering quality employment opportunities for people with print disabilities. So everything that I'll share in this session is informed by the work of our team members who do have print disabilities. And I'll introduce myself as well. I'm Leah Brochu. I'm the Accessible Publishing and Resources Coordinator at NNELS. A big part of my role is working closely with publishers and creating resources to help them build more accessible content. Recently, this has included doing a lot of close work on digital content, and that's what we'll look at today. So quick overview before we dive in. Today I'll do an introduction to accessibility. Then we'll discuss the concepts of accessibility by design, inclusive design, and born accessibility. Then we'll talk about standards and guidelines, mostly the WCAG, the kind of gold standard web content accessibility guidelines. Then we'll do some image descriptions and best practices, do's and don'ts on designing for accessibility, which has really helpful infographics. So if you're overwhelmed by the WCAG section, then just wait for the do's and don'ts section where I try to simplify it all. And then we'll have time for Q&A. So a quick thing to note is that my expertise is really around users with print disabilities, but we will incorporate discussions of other disabilities, other user groups as well. And we're not going to be touching on specific digital platforms, but we're going to give general advice applicable to a variety of digital content. So starting with our introduction to accessibility. First thing to kind of develop a definition for is, what is disability? So the concept is simple. Accessibility is about creating communities, workplaces, and services that enable everyone to participate fully in society without barriers. And by extension, digital accessibility is about creating content that can be accessed and used by everyone in order to create a more inclusive and barrier-free society. Why is it so important? A big factor is because it's good for everyone. If you're talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion without including accessibility, it's missing a big piece of the picture. And you can't be inclusive if you aren't accessible. It's good for everyone, not just people identified as having print disabilities or other disabilities. To define disabilities, disability, and this is from the Accessible Canada Act. I'm sure that the American definition is not far. It means any impairment, including physical, mental, intellectual, cognitive, learning, communication, or sensory, whether permanent, temporary, or episodic, that causes a barrier and hinders the person's full and equal participation in society. So accessibility is an attempt to bridge that gap, to knock down those barriers. There's different types of disabilities. We kind of mentioned them in the definition, so I won't go into them, but there's physical, cognitive, blindness and low vision, hearing, and speech. Those are the main categories. A few worldwide statistics particular to print disabilities, but they're still really important here, especially because you guys most work in such a visual space. So the number of people over 65 is projected to increase by 3 times by 2050 to 1.5 billion by mid-century. And over 21% of the population in 64 countries will have reading impairments and vision impairments. Currently, less than 10% of materials published worldwide are accessible to readers with a print disability. This is talking about books, but I think I saw a review of that. Maybe the Web Accessibility Initiative of websites, they did a review of websites and they found about 1% of what they reviewed was an accessible website. So it's even more problematic in that space. Important reason for producing accessible content. It's often given purchasing preference, and readers with print disabilities actually love reading and consume a lot more books than the non-print disabled population. So those are just some key statistics, but basically the number of people with disabilities is not going down, and so meeting their needs is getting more and more important. And part of the way that they meet them is by using assistive technologies, which are hardware devices or softwares developed with features that are specifically helpful for people with print disabilities. Sorry, print disabilities rolls off my tongue, but I just mean disabilities. Some key ones. Screen readers. It's software that reads the text on the screen of a computer or device, so that a person can hear everything that's on the screen, and they can navigate it as well and read within applications. There's paid versions, there's free versions, built-in versions, for every different mobile device and computer you could have. A really common one is also screen magnification software. So that just magnifies portions of the screen, increasing visibility for users with a visual impairment. Refreshable braille displays are popular among people who are blind. I've got an example in this image here, but it's got all the pins at the bottom. So as the computer reads the text, the pins are raised, and the braille encoding can be read by touch, of course. For mobility disabilities, there's for some people, eye tracking technology is useful for them. It's a way of using your eyes to navigate the screen, and the technology can take cues from that and interact with the computer or device. That's a little overview of disabilities and how people with disabilities are accessing content. Now we'll take a minute to talk about accessibility by design. Go to that page. So design is a key aspect of accessibility. The terms accessible and inclusive are sometimes used interchangeably. They are linked concepts, but they do mean different things. Accessibility in design terms refers to the qualities that make a product or service open to and usable by all. For digital content to be accessible, it needs to be flexible so that everyone can access it regardless of the tools or means that they use. So inclusive design refers to a design methodology used to create something with no barriers in the first place. An inclusive product is born accessible, quote unquote, born accessible, when it's designed to work for as many people as possible right from the start without modification. And that's the best way to do it. Accessible design is, of course, inclusive of people with disabilities. It's about designing for the needs of people with permanent, temporary, situational, or changing disabilities. Accessibility is essential, and it's not an add-on. Inclusive design is meant to account for all experiences. And just a quote from a paper that we wrote, when inclusion is consideration from the start, accessibility can become an organic part of a workflow. It can mean increased efficiency and a superior product, while at the same time, it can minimize remediation costs if accessibility barriers remain. Accessibility is not always cheap, fast, or easy. Actually, it never is, but incorporating it from the start can start to bridge to reduce those costs, because remediation is a whole other situation. Last kind of point in this theory section is about born accessible content. So digital content, it has the potential to be usable by people with disabilities, but it's not automatically accessible. Only if you're following accessibility standards and best practices will it be accessible, and that will make the content more robust and accessible for everyone. In an ideal world, all digital content will be born accessible, meaning that it will be fully accessible to everyone, regardless of their preferred format or their required format, and it'll be born accessible, meaning right at the start. To achieve born accessibility, the recommendations are to build accessibility into the formats and workflows you're using, create content that's designed to be inclusive from the beginning, and super important, involve everyone that you can. Often accessibility will be successful in an organization if there's one person championing it, but it takes the whole team, getting involved in order for it to really thrive and continue. So now we'll get into the standards and guidelines. It might be a bit technical, or some of them are hard to understand, but we'll come back to a more simplified version in a bit. So the gold standard for standards is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It covers a range of recommendations for making web content more accessible. Following these guidelines will make content accessible to a wide range of people with disabilities, including all of the ones we mentioned before. They're designed to meet everyone's needs. They were developed specifically for web content by the World Wide Web Consortium. So WCAG, or it's called the WCAG. It's based on 4 principles. Content must be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Perceivable means that the information and user interface components must be presentable to users in ways they can perceive, like seeing and hearing the content. Content must be operable. User interface components and navigation must be operable by typing by mouse or by voice. Usually that means kind of using valid HTML. Content must be understandable. So the information and operation of the interface must be able to be understood by the user and the computer system as well. And content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of assistive technologies. So those are the 4 principles. And WCAG also has levels. So there's the minimum level. This kind of, it meets lots of needs, not all needs. Then there's AA, which is more accessible. This is basically what most legislation is looking for. I know the Accessible Canada Act, it's basically looking for WCAG AA. And there is also WCAG AAA, which is even more accessible, but it's generally not required. It's very, very complex. And I haven't even included the AAA standards in here today, because if you want to get into them, go for it. But I'm not going to cover them today because they're too complex. So I'm going to go through, I'll kind of hop through the main guide or the main criteria here that WCAG has presented. And some of them I'll highlight the ones that are more understandable, and for ones that are quite technical, I won't get into them. I don't think that trying to define the down event of a pointer in relation to a single pointer input might be the best use of our time today, so I won't do deep dives on those. So this is, I've got a couple slides first of the perceivable criteria. So, and the first one has to do with non-text content. Basically, include alternative text for all non-decorative images. That's a huge one. Audio and video, include alternate ways of presenting the information when you have audio or video. So transcripts for podcast, text descriptions for silent video, just making sure that all information can be accessed by all users. Captions are a level A recommendation for pre-recorded videos, always include captions. For video content, include audio descriptions or media alternatives like a text description, so that all of, the whole video can be understood by all users. The first AA standard is including captions for live video. I don't think we have captions today, but that is a AA recommendation. Then there's pre-recorded audio description. So include audio descriptions for pre-recorded video content. This is similar to the one above, but you can't do anything alternate. No text description, just audio description. For information and relationships, this basically means use HTML as much as possible, and as many different elements as are needed. Tables, headings, lists, sides, block quotes, different forms of emphasis. That will make the information more useful to computers than having everything in p tags, kind of thing. Meaningful sequence means make sure that the information is presented in a logical reading order. Sensory characteristics, you need to ensure that instructions provided for understanding or interacting with or operating content don't rely on sensory characteristics. So nothing like, when you hear a sound, click the button, because not everyone's going to be able to hear that. So there always needs to be multiple ways of presenting instructions and information. Orientation, this one's a mildly technical one. Just make sure that a site can be used in portrait or landscape, unless it absolutely needs to be one way or another. And if it does, then that might be something to include in an accessibility statement, which is always recommended for using. Identify input purpose. That has to do with form fields. So just make sure that if there are forms, that they're built according to normal standards. And if that happens, then it's going to ensure that people and computers will be able to understand what those forms are about. Perceivable is the longest one, so I've got a few more here. Use of color. This is similar to the sensory characteristics one we just saw, but it's specifically about color. So ensure that color isn't the only visual means of conveying information, indicating an action, prompting response, or distinguishing a visual element. Frequently, this is links. So a lot of time people will use just color for a link and not underline. But if there's not the underline, then people who have color blindness, they might not be able to tell that that's a link. So yeah, using something in addition to color is recommended. Audio control has to do with built-in players. So ensure that users can pause, stop, mute, or control the volume of any audio. Contrast has to do with colors, color contrast. Ensure that that color contrast is sufficient. And I'm going to come back to color contrast in a few minutes, and I've got a little example, but it needs to, yeah, it needs to meet the standards. Ensure that text can be resized up to 200% larger than the original without causing any issues. So that's just something to do in the testing. Make sure you can blow it up and it seems okay. Avoid using images of text unless they're absolutely necessary. If you can use CSS or styling to have text instead of images of text, that's great. If you do have an image of text and you need to have it there, just make sure to put what's written in it in the alt text. I think this might be the last slide for perceivable. Text should be reflowable. Users, so the A criteria was making sure that resize text, ensure that text can be resized up to 200%. And the AA criteria is that users should be able to get a web page magnified up to 400%. So that's possible. Try and hit that. Color contrast, again, ensure that contrast between non-text content and the background content is sufficient. Text spacing, make sure that users can manipulate the text spacing. It kind of has to do with the blowing up as well. Content on hover or focus. There's some rules about hover text, and I'm not going to dig into those. I'll confuse myself. I wrote these simplified language versions of the WCAG guidelines, and it was a feat. But some of them are still hard. Some of them just can't be boiled down. But now we're into operable. So operable basically means that people can navigate the website and it's all going to work. Nothing's going to trip them up. So the first one has to do with keyboard, and that's ensure that users can operate all the functions on a site using a keyboard interface. For the most part, you know, if it's a website you're building from HTML, as long as you're building it correctly, that's not going to be a problem. But it's still something worth testing. You can find organizations that will do accessibility testing. NELS will do accessibility testing. So if you need someone to test the site who is using screen reader, that's recommended, because they might be able to find things like the next criterion, which is keyboard trap. So sometimes when users navigate via a keyboard, you know, not a mouse, sometimes they might get trapped on an item. So let's make sure that that doesn't happen. Character key shortcuts. Some sites develop their own unique shortcuts, and so just make sure that people can kind of escape those and use their common shortcuts, because keyboard navigators use a lot of complex keyboard shortcuts. So just make sure that they can still use those. Adjustable timing. If there's things with the time limit, make sure that the user can disable that, adjust it, or have a warning. And there are exceptions for real-time restrictions like auctions and that kind of thing. But just, yeah, be sure that people can know what's going on. For blinking, scrolling, or auto-updating content, make sure it meets these kind of tricky guidelines. I won't go into that one. 3 flashes and below. So this is kind of a seizure-inducing guide. Ensure that the site doesn't contain anything that flashes more than 3 times in 1 second. It's unless that flashing is sufficiently small. There's always little extra tricky bits to it, but basically just avoid flashing. Bypass blocks. That's something to dig into a little deeper. Make sure that every page has a descriptive title. So the title is what comes up on the tab, like when you have a bunch of tabs open, what you're seeing in that field that you can see at the top of the web page is what's in the title field. And sometimes for some sites, it will just always say the name of the site, but it should actually say the name of the page that it's on. So that's including descriptive title information for each web page. Focus order, just make sure that the keyboard navigation follows the correct sequence, which basically means having the code of the materials on the page be in the right order that you need them to be. Link text, this one's an easy one. Ensure that every active link has useful link text, such as view our spring catalog instead of click here. Click here is terrible. Keep screen reader users, they can access like a list of links, and the list of links will actually be the link text. So if there's a page that has click here in 5 places, then they'll just hear click here, click here, click here. They'll have no idea where any of those click here's go unless they take more steps to find out. So just make useful link text and it solves that problem. Make sure that there's more than one way to locate pages on a site. Having a search function is great. Having menu navigation is great. That one's pretty straightforward and usually is met right away. Make sure headings and labels are descriptive and useful. Focus visible. Ensure that any component of a page that can be used by a keyboard gives a visual indication when it's active. This is an example of something that's useful for all users, not just people with disabilities. I've run into this before where you don't know if something's active or not. So if you're in a search field and it's got a blinking cursor, then you know that you're in there. Pointer gestures, this one's very tricky and I'm not going to dive into it. There's something, there's multi-pointer path-based gestures. Basically, just make sure to dig into that one if you're going to have complex functionality on your site. Pointer cancellation, that's another one if you're going to have complex functionality, dig into this one. Label in name, this one is mostly using, again, HTML and forms. There's lots for when you're building HTML, when you're building forms, there's recommendations online, developed by the W3C. They've got the rules there, so just follow the rules. Make sure that that items have names that computers can read. Often, if there's a button, people won't label the button, and so screen reader users will just hear button with no indication of it being like a submit button or a search, that kind of thing. Motion actuation, make sure that any function that's activated, like shaking your device, can also be accomplished by an interface component like cancel or undo. Now we're on to understandable. Ensure that every language of a page is identified in the HTML element. For other digital content, if it's a PDF, you can set the language in the properties of the document. Same with a Word document, you can set these things in the properties. So just dig into how the language is presented so that computers will be sure to read it with the right accent, the right voice. The AA criteria for language is identifying language of parts. So language of phrases and sentences that are in a different language than the main language of the text should be marked up so that they're pronounced correctly. There's exceptions. Common phrases like joie de vivre, those will generally be read correctly. Screen readers are generally pretty smart, but if there's something longer, like an actual French sentence, then you want to mark that up. On focus and on input, those ones are kind of tricky, so I won't try and go into those. Consistent navigation is a pretty straightforward one. Just make sure that the website is really logical and repetitive. So you think about like a Wikipedia page, those are always exactly the same. It's so predictable, and that helps a user easily navigate the site since they're not going to be thrown any curveballs. For consistent identification, it's again just ensuring consistency. If you have a little picture of an envelope that usually sends opens up an email to send to someone, make sure that in another context doesn't take someone to a different page that opens up a form or something. So just ensure that functions or that components are always lining up. No curveballs. Error identification, that's mostly for like when you're putting in a form. So let's say you have a form, you type your, you type a non-existent postal code or zip code. Make sure that that's identified maybe by text and like not just by color. Just make sure that that can be identified by any user. Provide clear labels or instructions for helping people fill out forms. Another one in the error area is that if people do put in, a non-existent postal code or zip code or something like that, try and maybe, if it works, show options that it could be. So fixing a date is kind of a common one. Error prevention, that one is for legal commitments or financial transactions for the user. So I'm just gonna, I don't think that's happening a lot. And this last one is robust. And these ones are a bit tricky, so they're worth diving into. The first one is parsing. Make sure that all elements have complete start and end tags. So basically just make sure that your HTML is valid. That's the way to boil that one down. Name, role, and value. This is kind of covered in the, I think in another principle, but it's important enough to be reiterated in robust. The name and role of all user interface components should be able to be understood by software. And yeah, this one's usually for web authors who developed or script their own user interface components. So don't worry too much about it unless you're developing a unique, complex content. And status messages, this is for when a user completes an action. Sometimes a status message will come up like 5 results returned, email address required, form submitted. So make sure that that content is designed to be announced by a screen reader, because it won't often happen automatically. So there's ARIA roles that you can tag to the messages to make sure that they are, and there's different ones, alert, status, or log, depending on the situation. So that was the run through, and you will be provided with these slides for reference. And I've also included, I will include more information in the resources. So a checklist, a textbook, and the W3C's breakdown of the criteria. So now we're going to take the train to EasyTown and talk about some general guidelines in plain language for accessible digital content. So the first one is we use plain language, which is what we're doing now. That's a really important tip for all kinds of people is using plain language. Don't just meet the reader where they are. Use headings for structure, simple, super important. This goes for PDFs and Microsoft Word documents as well. If you're making Microsoft Word documents and exporting those to PDF, make sure you're using words headings, that the built-in heading levels. And then when you export that document, the PDF will have headings as well, and it will have bookmarks and navigation, and it's just so helpful. Make sure your link text is useful. This is another plain language one. Just always make sure that it's not click here. If a user can't adjust a font, choose sans serif fonts, as we've done here. It's cleaner and it's more preferred. And add alt text to images, provide long descriptions if needed, super important. And ensure that color contrast is sufficient. And you can do this using the color contrast analyzer. So this one comes up a lot. So I wanted to actually just take a minute to look at it after I clear my throat shortly. One second. Thank you. So color contrast is really important for people with low vision and people with color blindness. And this is quite a few people. So I just wanted to have a quick kind of demo. I'm not going to do anything, but we'll call it a demo. So the image on the left is a color blindness test. Maybe some of you can see the number in the middle, maybe some of you can't. In the screenshot on the right, we can see this is the color contrast analyzer tool. You can download, it's free. You can see that I've clicked the foreground and the background colors using the color picker tool of the program, and it fails all tests. So you can use the color picker, pick a foreground color, use the color picker, pick a background color, and then you can see if it passes or fails any test, and this one fails on all counts. So to fix that, you would, try different things. And so this is obviously in the color contrast analyzer screenshot. It's a very ugly color combination, but I just picked it as an example of something that, as you can see at the bottom, does pass all requirements. But there are more attractive color combinations that will still pass the requirements. Color contrast analyzer is really good to use for images of text and that kind of thing. If there are automated tools that will check, the actual text of a site against the background, but those automated checkers can't do images of text. So that's a case where you might want to use this. And now I'm going to go through some image description guidelines. And we'll make sure we get lots of time for questions. So don't worry, I won't, not too much longer. Image description guidelines. Decorative images don't need to be described. So that just means that some little decorative images like a border or just a little visual element, these things don't need description, but all other images do, including logos. Write descriptions with a clear structure. The hot tip is to start with general and get more specific. You want to write descriptions based on context. Always review the context and be mindful of why a certain image is being included. Write for your audience. If your audience likely knows what a triptych is, you probably don't have to explain that concept before describing the panels. Pay special attention to the intended age of your audience. It's okay to work in a little bit of whimsy for kids, that kind of thing. Aim for conciseness. You want to try to stick to 1 to 3 sentences, but if you need more, don't worry too much. Use present tense and action verbs. These, this will help with being concise, and it's really the most natural sounding voice for description, like Mona Lisa smiles versus Mona Lisa is smiling. Be objective, because everyone deserves the opportunity to develop their own interpretation of a work. Is this easy? No. Is it important? Yes. Don't censor. This can be hard for some people. If you can't bring yourself to describe something, get someone to help you, because you can't limit that experience for readers or for viewers or for anyone. Text within images needs to be written out somewhere. That one's simple. And don't rely on captions. These all link to our image description guidelines, which have visual examples and lots more discussion of each topic. So that was our brief image description guidelines. We're getting close to the end here. This do's and don'ts section, I have a collection of infographics here from the UK government. Some people might find useful for reference. It really boils down WCAG. In the slides, in the notes section, I've added the text descriptions in each image. So it's all there for you if you wanted it written out. And I've got the link in the resources as well. So I won't go through these too deeply because they're really just for reference, just reiterating what WCAG states, but in general. So for users with anxiety, you want to make sure that everything is cleanly laid out, clearly explained, and that help is easy to find. For users on the autism spectrum, use plain language with descriptive and informative text, meet color contrast guidelines, build clean layouts. For deaf and hard of hearing users, again, use plain language, use subtitles and captions, use a clean layout. For users with physical disabilities, make large clickable actions, give lots of space on forms. Again, a clean layout is important. For users with dyslexia, kind of the same thing. Keep a clean layout, consider using diagrams or images to support text. For users with low vision, use color contrast guidelines, clean layout, and preferably one that repeats across pages if possible. And finally, for screen reader users, all of the above, plus include alt text, use HTML, and write useful link text. So hopefully these infographics are useful for you to use. And one big don't that I wanted to cover was don't use overlays. Accessibility overlays are products that modify the code of a web page, usually in the form of a plugin, app, toolbar, or widget. Companies that create and promote the use of overlays claim their products automatically detect and fix accessibility issues, but they're not the answer. They often don't work for many people because the technologies, the assistive technologies that people are using don't work with these overlays. they just seem like they're a solution, but they're not. So the answer is, if not overlays, then it's just everything we've covered in this presentation. There's no quick fix. It's WCAG, it's HTML, it's not overlays. I won't go any further on that. But if you're interested in learning more, or if your organization is looking at implementing accessibility overlays, please go to the overlayfactsheet.com and read that first. I'm not affiliated with them. It's just, I mean, I'm affiliated with people who have disabilities, and they all hate overlays. Got a link here for testing websites that'll be useful, and a link here from the World Wide Web Consortium about building accessibility statements. That's for websites, so you can put it in a document. Think outside the box and put accessibility statements wherever you want. That's what we like to say. And final thought here. So accessibility is a lot of work, but it's important to remember that this work should always have been done. The work before was incomplete. It was exclusive and it wasn't right. This is from Amanda Leduc, who is a disabled Canadian author. And yeah, that's about it. Engage people who have lived experience, work with everyone on your team, think outside the box, and embrace accessibility. And now I will turn it to questions, if there are any.
Leah, thank you. This is thank you also for making it clear that you're willing to share the slides, because I think this is a presentation that provides such a deep overview, right, of so many topics that we're all going to be able to dig into for a long time as we're thinking about the implications for our accessible products. So thank you for being so generous with sharing all of that. As we said earlier, if you have any questions, take a second, process, but do put them in the chat, because we do have time to talk about those. I can start with one, Leah, and you provided some great initial thoughts on preparing alt text, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the distinction between alt text and extended descriptions, and when publishers are using which of those in what contexts. And I see Michelle was also anticipating that question as well. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, the big difference is the length in the presentation. So alt text is often used interchangeably with the term image description, but alt text really specifically is a few sentences, like no more than 2 to 3 sentences, because it can only ever be a string of text that's embedded in the image. So if you need if you need multiple paragraphs, if you want to use point form, if you want to use a table, like if you have a graph and you want to represent that information, if you have the in a table, that's what you'll want to link out to. And where to put those it can be as creative as you want. It can be kind of in a footnote. It can be on a different web page. If it's an EPUB, it could be in a different section of the book. There's, as long as, yeah, an extended description is just a linked description that's usually for a lot more information than a few sentences. There is some recommendations out there that you might hear that say keep alt text to no more than 125 characters. We don't know where that came from. We've run our own tests on it, and it's fine. It can, like, 125 characters, that's short. I don't think I've ever written an alt text that's 125 characters. Mine are usually, 1 to 4 sentences, and that's going to be fine. Yeah, is that?
Yeah, thanks. And I've seen length restrictions noted like that as well. So that's very helpful to know that those might be.
Yeah, I think that's from maybe old software, old reading systems. But yeah, I've had my blind coworkers check it out. I'm like, why are there these rules? And they say to me, I don't know.
Okay.
And I'm blind.
Okay, we have one question in the chat here from Maria. My team is developing an ebook for middle school students that will include image descriptions and audio voiceover narration. Does it make sense to have the voiceover artist record the image descriptions in addition to the main text and captions?
That one is tricky. Let me think for a second. It can't. So if it's an EPUB, there's maybe different ways to go about it. I've seen EPUBs that it has media overlay, so that's audio narration that matches up with the book. And we had one that was in an Indigenous language and in English. And at the start of the book, you could pick whether you were going into the Indigenous track or the English track. So we have kind of recommended the idea maybe of having like with image descriptions voiced and with them not voiced. When you have media overlays going, if you're listening to those, if you're enabling that track, then you're not using your screen reader, right? You're using the system's read aloud feature and it's not accessing the code. So the image descriptions won't be read out, unless the person like exits out of the read aloud feature and then goes back into it. So yeah, there's not a perfect solution when you have media overlays embedded. So yeah, recording the image descriptions in addition to plain text it's a great idea. You could also, if incorporate them into the book, just the mainstream of the book, because then that's introducing accessibility to everyone, which is also a cool way to think about it. Be like, this book has image descriptions, and doesn't hurt anyone. Just maybe it's a few seconds that they might say weird, but yeah.
Great. Question here from Greg. How do you counsel publishers who look at the depth and breadth of work that needs to be done to make their content fully accessible and go weak in the knees? Where do you start with that outreach?
I hear that a lot for sure. And what we try to tell people is just like dip a toe. You don't have to have everything all at once. The main things include image descriptions and use headings, and that's going to get you leaps and bounds like into accessibility. There's so many books that people get and it doesn't have any headings and it's just a wall of text with no navigation. But if there's headings, then they can navigate it. And if there's image descriptions, then they have access to all the content. So it's definitely like a dipping your toe situation. And there's lots of help out there. And I spend too much time answering questions and not do my actual job. So if you have any questions, like info@accessiblepublishing.ca, hit me up, because I won't be able to stop myself from giving you way too much information and trying to solve things. There's lots of resources and guidance out there. But yeah, dipping a toe, starting with headings and alt text. And I know that just do alt text. I know it's huge. I know it's a wild thing. But we like to say even bad alt text is better than no alt text. People would rather hear like a woman in a rocking chair rather than what we hear often, which is like image or worse, like img_67ff32.jpg. So yeah, baby steps.
Let's see here. I'm curious, you've spoken about how you've incorporated feedback from users with disabilities in these guidelines. I mean, do you have any more details that you can share on, particularly irritating or vexing qualities to the products that you're dealing with, things that you find, oh my gosh, we always have to remediate this in files that we're getting from publishers, anything like that we can be thinking about proactively?
Yes, millions of things. Let me try and think. Yeah, image descriptions, navigations, those are like the big ones. People not using HTML fully is a lot of people will make a book in InDesign or whatever in InDesign. And in InDesign, you can tag your paragraph styles and character styles to the useful HTML that will get output. But I often get a book that just says, everything is paragraph with a class of heading, paragraph with a class of block quote, paragraph with a class of italic, or whatever, semantic with class. But that's not useful to people with print disability. So it's really just like get in there, learn a little bit about HTML, and tag things so that the computers can understand it more. I'm trying to think of other things. I don't know. There's too many things, so I'm like blanking. Let me go to my FAQ page on the Accessible Publishing site, which I invented on my own. I was like, I think people ask these questions regularly.
While Leah's looking, we'll probably have time for another couple of questions if anyone wants to add those to the chat.
Let's see. A lot of people ask about, this is a common question, so I'll just bring it up here, and maybe it's coming more in Canada here, but a lot of people ask about incorporating Indigenous languages and tagging Indigenous languages. Screen readers are not caught up to it. Like they only have so many languages that they know how to pronounce correctly, but we still recommend looking up the appropriate language code. A lot of Indigenous languages actually have an appropriate language code in the IANA language subtag registry. And if you can tag text with that, then it's kind of like future-proofing it. So when screen readers catch up, then it's going to be able to be read properly. So that's something I like to mention to people. Go to the IANA language subtag registry, find a language tag, try and mark up all your other language text properly so that it's read out correctly in the future.
Yeah, that's great. But I think thank you for emphasizing that the standards, the technology, all will continue to evolve and change. It's not just going to be as simple as saying, hey, we're accessible, and then it's done forever, which segues nicely into Lauren's question in the chat. Do you have any broad recommendations for remediation? Lauren reports that they're working on digitizing a number of backlist titles through scanning and providing PDFs online. And can you talk about any key things to look out for when wanting to make sure that those PDFs are accessible?
PDFs are hard and they are frequently inaccessible. Like we've never, I know that it's a very common and popular format, but they're so rarely are they ever accessible. For PDFs, you can look into each page and make sure that the reading order is correct. You can, it'll highlight each paragraph and you can dictate the reading order of each thing. And you can also tag each thing with a heading, or you can say it's a paragraph or that kind of thing. So yeah, with PDFs, you do have to dig into the items and tag the text. There's unfortunately there's nothing quick there. There's nothing quick to a lot of this, and I'm sensitive to that. But unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of answers. I have more resources on PDF stuff, so I'll put that into the resources section. But yeah, it's not something I've done a ton of work on. So let me pull it from my other colleagues' presentations, and I'll get that in the resources section for you. But I won't try and make up stuff that I don't really know about.
No, that would be so helpful. Thank you so much. I think with that, we've gotten most of the questions from the chat, and so I think we'll move to a conclusion. Leah, thank you again so much for sharing all of this with us. Thank you for being willing to share your slides. Thank you for your generosity in offering to answer all of our questions. We will hopefully not take too much advantage of you about that, but thank you. A reminder to everyone, please do be in touch with us through our email address. We're looking at our next call being on August 23rd at noon Eastern. We always are interested in hearing your suggestions for new topics, for presenters, for projects that you want to learn more about. Feel free to volunteer yourself. Feel free to volunteer a friend or a colleague. Just send notifications for things that you want to learn more about. We do listen to those and we appreciate them very much. Please do sign up for our mailing list so you can be sure to get a reminder in advance of our next call. And with that, thank you. And I hope everyone has a good rest of your Tuesday. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Leah.